Well, good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for day 2 of the Body Worn Camera National Meeting. I'm Dr. Brittany Cunningham. I'm the project manager for the Body Worn Camera TTA program and also a site TTA analyst. Today, we're going to open up with a presentation and a discussion on constitutional policing and body worn camera footage. Before we get started, I will remind all of us of a few helpful hints. Please keep your phones or computer audio on mute to avoid any background noise. This session is being recorded, so others may view it later on our website. We do want to hear from you again today, so I do encourage all of you to post comments or questions using the chat function. You can either direct your questions to the host or you can send them to everyone anytime throughout the session. Please do edit your display name by hovering over your name, clicking more, choosing the rename option, and changing your screen name to reflect your full name, title, and agency. This will help us ensure we mark you down for your grant requirement. After the meeting, there will be an opportunity to evaluate it. Please do so. This provides us for input of all of our sessions, as well as it helps us improve for future events. As a reminder, points of view or opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. Thank you again for joining today. So let's get started with day 2. I'd like to turn it over and introduce you to body worn camera expert and the endowed family chair of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice and director of the Violence Prevention and Community Safety at Arizona State University, Dr. Chuck Ketz.
Thanks so much, Brittany. Well, thanks everybody for joining us on day 2 here. We're excited to have everybody here. Our next panel is, I think it's going to be a good one. It's on promoting constitutional policing through the use of body-worn camera footage. We have 3 panelists today. One is Mike White. He is our TTA co-director. He's also a professor at Arizona State University, associate director of the Center for Violence Prevention and Community Safety, and he has published extensively on body-worn cameras in the United States and is known as one of the foremost experts on this topic. We also have Director Ryan Bonizak. He is the director of the public safety with the Sturgis Police Department. The agency has approximately 20 sworn police officers and about 13 firefighters. We also have Lieutenant Anthony Aceto with the Camden County Police Department. He's commander of the Professional Development Division in Camden County. With this, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. White.
All right, thanks, Chuck. So I thought what we should do before we dive in is to actually explain what we mean by constitutional policing. So if we go to the next slide, I think that's probably a good place to start. And I realized about 15 minutes ago that we didn't have a slide that did this, so I created one real quick. But I think it's important if we're going to have this discussion and talk about how body-worn cameras can contribute to constitutional policing, we should at least discuss what we mean by that. And certainly, first and foremost, what we mean is that constitutional policing is police practice that is lawful. That is, the Constitution provides a legal framework, and constitutional policing is policing that is consistent with that legal framework. But it's more than that. It's also police practice that is procedurally just. That's a term we've mentioned several times. Yesterday, you probably heard it before. Policing that is fair, that is respectful, that gives voice to the community members that are interacting with officers, and that is impartial, free from bias. And then last, police practice constitutional if it's perceived by the community as being legitimate. And to use the words of Tom Tyler, that means it's deemed by the community as being appropriate, proper, and just. So really what the 4 of us want to talk about today is how body-worn cameras can help us achieve these lofty goals of constitutional policing. Next slide. Since I'm a professor, I'm going to use the PowerPoint to illustrate my points. I'll take about 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues who are going to talk more conversationally about the things that are going on in their police departments. But what I wanted to do was discuss a project I've been involved in for the last 4 years with the Tempe, Arizona Police Department. And the focus of the project is de-escalation training. And really what I'd like to do is talk about how body-worn camera footage has been involved in every aspect of that project, all towards the goal of achieving constitutional policing through de-escalation. Next slide. So what I'll do is I'll give you just a brief thumbnail sketch of the project. You can send me a message if you'd like to hear more about this project. I can send you the final report. I can send you articles that we've published. I'm going to really just scratch the surface here. But what I want to do is I want to highlight how body-worn camera footage was absolutely crucial to the 3 different components of this project. The first is developing the actual curriculum. what should be included in the de-escalation curriculum that is provided to officers. And then second is the use of footage in the actual training to demonstrate exceptional practices that are not so good. And then last, how footage was used in the evaluation of the training to determine whether the training achieved the goals that the department sought it to achieve. And then I'll kick it over to Director Banasak and the Lieutenant, and then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. So, but let's dive right in with this project. Next slide, please. This was a BJA funded project. It was funded through their Smart Policing Initiative, the Tempe, Arizona Police Department, which has about 350 sworn officers. Tempe and ASU received the grant back in 2017, and it was a very, very straightforward project. Essentially, design, deliver, and evaluate de-escalation training. Just let me talk briefly about each of these different phases of the project before we get into the use of footage. The first phase, the design phase, the Tempe leadership had decided pretty much right off the bat that they wanted to build their own training. They didn't want to just kind of take an off-the-shelf training that existed. Rather, they wanted to customize one that was ideally suited for their department, their officers, their community. So as you'll see, they spent about 18 months building the actual curriculum. The second phase, the delivery phase, it was delivered kind of in two phases. One was kind of traditional 10-hour classroom-based training, one-day training. Those 10-hour sessions occurred in February and March of 2020. But after that, there were a series of online refresher trainings that occurred in the months that followed, which reinforced the skills that were part of the training. And I'll talk about how body cam footage was crucial to each of those components of the training. And then also the last phase, my job as the researcher was to evaluate it. It was a randomized controlled trial, so it was a rigorous study. We randomized at the squad level. So that meant that there were squads of officers who were randomly selected to receive the training and those that were randomly selected to not get it. And of course, the comparison to determine impact was looking at the differences between those two groups. So let's move into that first phase, which is the building of the curriculum. Next slide. Given the grant that the department had, they had the liberty to take the time to be very deliberate in how they built this curriculum. Like I said, they didn't want to just take one off the shelf. So they spent about 18 months in this curriculum development phase, but they also knew they didn't need to start from scratch. So one of the most important things they did is they sent officers to other de-escalation trainings, about 24 of them. In some cases, these were online, some were local, some did not even focus on policing. A couple were in the public health setting and education, but mostly it involved putting police officers on airplanes to go attend trainings across the country. That included some of the most popular trainings like PERFs ICAT, T3 training. They went to specific departments, in particular the LAPD. That training really resonated with them. And the idea was to learn what others are doing in this arena, bring that back and kind of pick and choose which elements they wanted to include in the Tempe training. But the piece in curriculum development that's most relevant for our discussion this morning with body cameras is what you see at the bottom of the slide. The department wanted to make sure that they, what I called, harness the local expertise. They knew that they had exceptional de-escalators in their department. The question was how to find them and then how to make sure those officers were intimately involved in the creation of this training. So what we did is we did a peer nomination. We asked every officer in the department to anonymously write down the names of 3 of their colleagues who they thought were truly exceptional at de-escalation and who absolutely had to be involved in this project. And from that peer nomination process, we were able to identify 14 officers who were selected by their peers as really being the all-stars in terms of de-escalation. And then my research team spent about 6 months with those officers, just watching them do their thing in the field. We interviewed them, but the key for our purposes here this morning is the focus groups we held with top de-escalators, usually 4 or 5 of them. We asked them in these focus groups to bring body-worn camera footage to the meeting. In some cases, they brought their own. In some cases, they brought footage involving other officers that they had worked with. In some cases, we used footage that was from outside the department. But the idea here was to get these group of truly exceptional de-escalators together, have them watch footage, have them talk about it. What worked, what didn't, what could have gone differently, what else could they have done? And the whole focus here with the footage was to figure out what should be included in the actual training. What are the themes, the tactics, the principles that should be built into this training? And the use of the footage was absolutely crucial to that phase. Next slide. The second piece of this project where the footage was absolutely critical, and again, this all goes toward this issue of constitutional policing. The second thing was to use footage in the actual delivery of the training. A couple things you see on this slide. One is on the left is the graphic that we created for the training. And I mentioned the LAPD de-escalation training that really resonated with Tempe. It was called their patrol model. Patrol is an acronym. You can see what it stands for, but it was a central piece of the de-escalation training. What you see on the right side of the slide in the bullets, these are the blocks of training during that 10-hour one-day session. And it started off with a definition of de-escalation for Tempe. They grounded their definition in officer safety, health, and wellness. In fact, you'll see as you read through these that the morning blocks were all focused on officer health and wellness. Pre-care, self-management. What are your sources of stress? How do you manage stress? How do you deal with trauma? And then it moved into things like active listening and emotional intelligence. And then the morning or the afternoon was much more tactical and focused. But body-worn camera footage was used throughout this day of training in all the different elements to emphasize key points, to start discussions about tactics. And it was really crucial. And in addition to that, I mentioned that in the months that followed the one-day session, there were online trainings. And these were completed by squads at their pre-shift roll calls before they went out onto the street. The training unit had created videos using footage that was narrated. It used music. It was kind of cool. And the idea was to have the squads watch this footage and then talk about it amongst themselves with their sergeant. And the idea here was to reinforce skills, to make sure that there was no attenuation of skills over time. So the footage was absolutely crucial in delivery of the training. Next slide. The last piece was the evaluation. I said it was a randomized controlled trial. There were about 100 officers in each group, the trained group and the not trained group. And like I said, all we did to assess the question of did it work is we compared those two groups of officers, those that got the training and those that didn't. We used a variety of different data sources to attack that question. We did surveys of officers. Obviously, we looked at administrative data like use of force and complaints. We interviewed hundreds of citizens who had encounters with Tempe officers. But really, the most powerful piece of the evaluation was the review of body-worn camera footage. My team reviewed hundreds of hours, probably thousands of hours of footage, including officers who got the training and those who didn't, trying to determine how the training influenced the dynamics of encounters with community members, how officers were using that training to manage those encounters. And we did this in two ways, and it was really compelling. The first was we just did random reviews, selecting officers, selecting videos, just to get those more routine kinds of encounters that happen every single day. And the second piece then was we reviewed footage of all use of force encounters 6 months before the training and 6 months after. And what we had done is we created a very detailed data collection instrument that captured up to 160 different pieces of information about every encounter, what the officer said and did, what the community member said and did, who else was at the scene, what type of call was it, and then of course the use of de-escalation tactics. Go to the next slide. The random review, what we did is each week we randomly picked 10 officers, 5 that had gotten the training and 5 that didn't. And then for each of those 10 officers, we went into evidence.com, they're an Axon user, and we randomly selected a video that each of those officers had uploaded within the last week. And we were doing this every week. So every week we're randomly selecting officers, randomly selecting videos, watching those videos, and then just kind of telling the story of what happened. And what you see on this slide are some findings we identified, some differences between those two groups of officers, those that got the training and those that didn't. And these go to the very core of what we're talking about with constitutional policing. So for example, trained officers were significantly less likely to use a condescending or patronizing tone. They were more likely to try to build rapport with a citizen, less likely to fail to transfer control to another officer if necessary, less likely to use charged or imposing body language, and more likely to resolve very routine, mundane encounters informally. What I'd like to think about is how you capture this kind of nuance in a police-citizen encounter. There's no way to get that by looking at administrative data on use of force or complaints, or even talking to officers or citizens. It was the body-worn camera footage and the review of that footage that led to these very important differences and really that point to the impact of this training on how officers were handling encounters in a way that is consistent with some of those principles associated with constitutional policing, like procedural justice. Next slide. I wanted to highlight real quick two findings from the review of the footage and use of force encounters. So we reviewed, like I said, every encounter where a Tempe officer used force 6 months before and after the training, collected that ton of information I mentioned before through the routine review, but two findings I wanted to highlight here that I think are interesting. One is the length of the encounter, and the pre-post means before the training and after the training. So if you look at the train group, you can see that the length of their use of force encounters increased by 15 minutes. At the same time, the length of encounters for officers who didn't get the training declined by 15 minutes. And I think that's entirely consistent with the key aspects of this training: slowing things down, using active listening, communicating, patience, tolerance, all of those aspects of the patrol model. And you can see how that played out in terms of it increasing encounter length. And perhaps the most important finding of the entire project, it involves citizen injuries that we documented through review of the footage. And what we saw is that in use of force encounters, officers who got the training were 58% less likely to injure a citizen. So just to wrap up, final slide before I kick it over to the director, we use footage in every aspect of this project in terms of building the actual training, what should be included, using the training to demonstrate exceptional and poor tactics, create those teachable moments. But really for me as the researcher, it was the evaluation. And departments obviously can do this themselves. We heard Dan Zender and Scott Hogue talked yesterday about auditing and compliance. We were essentially doing the same thing with footage with a different kind of focus in terms of the evaluation, but it just gives you such a nuanced look at what your officers are doing, how they're handling encounters. And for the evaluation, it took that did it work question really to a whole new level. So that's it for me. I think I'll kick it to the director and he can talk about some of the things they've been up to in Sturgis, Michigan.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. I'm going to kind of reiterate some of the things that Mike said. One of the things he talked about was the importance of reviewing that footage and what they gathered from that. For us as a smaller agency, one of the things that we were a little concerned about initially with body-worn cameras was how are we going to utilize them? How much staff is this going to take? And a lot of small agencies I talked to seems to be a concern of theirs. So we came up with some unique ways of making sure we're seeing footage on a regular basis, that we're learning from that footage. It's promoting constitutional policing through that review. So one of the areas that we've implemented is PERF's article on constitutional policing. One of the areas they covered specifically was dealing with subjects suffering from mental health issues or subject in crisis. We're fortunate enough in Sturgis to have a community mental health worker that's assigned to our department that's here 3 to 4 days a week. And so whenever a video is recorded, we categorize them by specific categories that will allow us to find those videos to get them into the eyes of the person that's best able to review them and take some learning lessons from those videos. So one of our classification models is mental health call. So on all of our mental health calls, our in-house mental health worker will review that call after the fact to say, hey, how did we do, whether it's de-escalation, did we get them the proper resources, how could we have done better? And so the CMH side of that, on the mental health side, the information you can obtain from those videos has been fantastic and is something, it's kind of a lesson learned for us moving forward. The other areas that we work pretty hard on is identifying where our biggest issues at, where can we learn the most from that footage. And so we created what we call a fair and impartial policing audit. And that fair and impartial audit is done every quarter by a sergeant of their shift or platoon. And they'll go through and look at specific categories that the officers have categorized their videos by for areas to improve, again, what was done good. And then we'll use some of that footage training throughout the department. And our categories we're looking at are how are we dealing with juveniles? A lot of times, as an administrator, you see when you have a disciplinary issue, most times it's not intentional or willful, it's just a lack of knowledge or understanding of what was going on or how to do something. So trying to take that footage and learn from it. So dealing with juveniles, a high liability area, pursuit driving, all use of force videos get reviewed by use of force instructor to be implemented in future trainings. And so for us, it's been about how can we best harness that information obtained through the videos, and then how can we relay those lessons learned back to our officers. And so we're really pushing moving forward to get more videos, actual footage from our department, breaking it down at the supervisory level or at a instructor level, whether use of force, de-escalation, dealing with mental health incidents, taking those videos and then relaying those information learned back to the shifts. So that's been a big push for us. We think we're seeing the most benefit from that actual footage. A lot of times officers are hesitant to maybe use as an example, but using both good and bad examples and ways to improve and making a learning environment within the department, not a punitive, has been extremely beneficial for us. And is one of the ways that we're seeing body-worn cameras having their biggest impact within our agency. That's kind of what I have, and I'll turn it over to Lieutenant Aceto to talk a little about what they're doing in Camden County.
Great. Thank you both. And thank you all for this opportunity to speak on behalf of my agency and be a part of this. Greatly appreciate it. So some of the things I'm going to kind of repeat because it's things that we're doing in our agency as well. One of which is being a larger agency. So we're a 400 staffed department on a fully staffed day, 400 plus. So we designed a body-worn camera unit, which is structured as we have retired sworn personnel, officers that are sworn, assigned to it, and then civilians that are also assigned to review. And we get the perspective from both the officers, retired officers, and then also civilian aspect of how the officers are conducting themselves in terms of their professionalism. And that gets reviewed, then turned over to the training unit. I'm the commander of the training unit, so I kind of oversee that and structure that accordingly with the BWC unit, and my staff will review. We have an early warning system in place. So when the officer alerts for any type of concern, whether it be use of force or demeanor complaints, we coordinate that also with the body worn camera unit, and then they're placed on monitoring for 90 days. And that BWC unit gets the list of who the officers are who are on monitoring, and they'll pick up any type of demeanor complaints or issues that they feel as though maybe the officer still needs to be trained on. One of which I just had recently, the officer just in the past 3 months had 11 use of force incidents. So we break that down and say, why has he had such a high number of incidents in regards to or in relation to other officers? And when we reviewed it further, we found that the officer was utilizing condescending and patronizing tones. And that resulted in the use of force. It could have been de-escalated, and he probably could have avoided some of those use of force incidents. All of the use of force tactics themselves were justified, and the appropriate force was utilized, but it could have been avoided and it could have been better. So that's one of many ways on how we identify and train our officers. Another thing that we did in terms of what Mike said earlier is customizing training. We started with PERF and the ICAT training way before it became nationally known, and now it's required in New Jersey as part of our Attorney General guidelines, as part of our use of force. So all of our officers are trained in de-escalation in terms of the ICAP. And then what the director mentioned, fair and impartial policing, also they receive that. That's an in-person and a follow-up on Power DMS, which, by the way, all of our personnel that's assigned to our BWC unit are all trained in that fair and impartial policing. So they have a better understanding, especially on the civilian side, of what they're looking for, and try to take their personal biases out of it when they understand how the officer is reacting and responding to an event. So how we customize our training is we have the Virtua 300 simulator, and that has over 300 scenarios, a lot of which are an EDP type scenario, or a scenario where the officer can get up on the stage and learn their communication techniques and understand that they create space and time and use that to their advantage and not compress that space. So it's one of many ways that we train our officers, and like professional athletes, just as though they're professional, we're professional police officers. So what do pro athletes do? They review their game day footage. What do? We take our BWC footage, just like pro athletes do, and we evaluate it, and we will look to improve on an officer's response. A couple takeaways from our policy. One, we say that in our policy, BWCs are intended to enhance officer safety, promote accountability, and produce effective materials for training. And I can tell you, it's been invaluable for us. The officers, and I'll just give you some surveys that we did with our officers. Most of our officers have said that the greatest impact on them, just reviewing their own footage, was their safety tactics and officer safety. And they're able to conduct that self-assessment. And I think it's, as human beings, we're tough to be critics of ourselves. But when we put that up on the screen and we evaluate step by step an incident that they conducted out in the field, we look for room for improvement and signs that they could have used maybe more de-escalation tactics. It's one of many things on how we're training our officers. In addition to that, roll call training. We constantly go out, the training unit goes out to roll calls, and we go through de-escalation tactics. We talk about some of the things that Mike talked about, the online. We're constantly posting refresher courses online through DMS training that all the officers are required to complete. And then when we have time to out in the field, we'll have one of the training unit or members of the training unit go out and do practical scenarios, and almost like we call patrol concepts. I also run the police academy here. And when we train our new officers, we have a section during patrol concepts where it's live scenarios with police officers as the actors, but they get to learn those de-escalation techniques, and they understand that being out in the field, they have a body worn camera, and that body worn camera at times we found also has just been a device that de-escalated a scenario just because that citizen was aware that the officer had a camera. So it's been instrumental for us in many aspects of what we're doing to promote the accountability again, and ultimately just reviewing the officer's performance. And I think it's built a better relationship for us and the citizens. Our complaints and demeanor complaints are down. We've had people come in to complain about officers, and once they know that that incident was captured on video, they somewhat can retracted their complaint, and it helps officers in many ways. So it's very beneficial in terms of constitutional policing and enhancing our performance out there.
Great, thank you, Lieutenant. Well, we have about 15 minutes left on this panel. For those that might be interested in asking a question to the panel, feel free to go ahead and type that into the chat box, or feel free, I guess you can raise your hand on Zoom. But what I would like to start off with actually is a question for the Lieutenant. I thought that it was interesting that your early warning system or early intervention system is integrated in with your body-worn camera unit to a certain degree. I was wondering if you could follow that up with regard to how that process works and just how deep it goes. For example, the question that I had or was curious about was, after so many indicators have been hit and a threshold is met by an officer where there's an alert created for the early intervention system, you said that something was sent over to the body-worn camera unit. Does that mean that the body-worn camera unit then has the authority to go back and look at any footage that has taken place, or how much range or latitude do they have in this? And then is that used in a disciplinary fashion, or is it used in training? Can you explain a little bit about that? I think that has a lot of, regardless of the direction, I think it has a lot of there's a lot of potential there for its use.
Sure. So how the early warning system works is when an officer triggers, we'll say, use demeanor complaints as an example. That comes to our training unit. It's called the Professional Development Unit for training. My officers then review that footage and determine what sort of training needs to be done in terms of the complaint and why he or she are triggering for, let's say, a demeanor complaint. Once that training is done, we have weekly meetings with our BWC unit, and we give them an updated list weekly on who's in monitoring because of the early warning system and their triggers for whatever incident they had triggered for. The BWC unit then takes that, and now I'll take it a step further. The discretion, there is no discretion in terms of monitoring their videos. Once that officer has been placed on 90 days of monitoring, they are reviewing 100% of their videos. So, and we're staffed to do this. So let's say we have 10 or 15 or even 20 officers. Those 15 to 20 officers, or however many, are being monitored through the early warning system. The BWC unit gets a list of those officers, why they're being monitored, and they're reviewing 100% of their videos. Now, if we find something that's relative to a demeanor complaint and are continuing down that same path, then yes, it will come back to training. The BWC unit will send us a request for training. We'll review it. And then we'll determine at that point, we'll come to me and we'll determine then if it needs to go beyond just training and some type of progressive discipline, if you will.
Interesting. Thank you. Please, once again, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat, or let us know that you would like to ask a question. My next question is actually for Dr. White in terms of time in the encounter. While we saw that those who were trained, their encounters increased by, if I recall, around 15 minutes, but those that did not participate in training, their encounters declined in time. Why would that be?
It's a question that I've wrestled with, Chuck, and I mentioned when the training was rolled out, and if you heard what I said, you realize we had epically bad timing in delivering this training and trying to evaluate it. The one-day sessions occurred in February and March of 2020, just as the global pandemic was taking hold. And so the nature of police citizen encounters in Tempe and everywhere changed dramatically as we were trying to assess the impact of this training. And in Tempe, for example, there were specific policy changes that were made to reduce contact between officers and community members. Certain types of calls no longer received an actual response by a physical police officer coming on scene. Rather, they were handled over the phone or in other ways. So, and given everything that was happening, I suspect officers either subconsciously or consciously were trying to reduce the length of encounters to reduce the risk of infection. I mean, think about this was, just as stay-at-home orders were being issued. So I think that played a large role in the change in the length of encounter for officers who didn't receive the training, which then really makes it impressive, I guess. I can't think of the right word, that the length of encounters for officers who received the training, despite everything that was going on in Tempe and the rest of the world, still increased.
Interesting. Thank you. We do have one question that came across to Lieutenant Aceto. The process for using the early warning system to also monitor body-worn cameras, is that a written policy within your agency? What was the reaction of the officers and union?
It is a written policy that we have in place. It's rather extensive because based on the officer's performance, and if they continue to trigger, then they go into a one-on-one mentoring program where we have an officer assigned to that officer who triggered for, and again, I just use a broad spectrum of demeanor complaints, that they're assigned to then a senior officer who we establish and identify as a mentor. And then they're essentially, it's almost like the FTO program, but broken down and specialized into mentoring that officer on how they're interacting with the public. So yes, it is. And in terms of how the union responded, we didn't get much pushback at all. They understood that this is a positive reinforcement for officers. And not only do we look at the BWC footage and look in terms of discipline, we also identify officers on a positive note, and we use that also for commendations. So I think the officers understand the impact it's had on our agency, and we've seen a response to how the officers have been conducting themselves.
Okay, Lieutenant, I think you're going to start to get peppered here with some questions. I think that there's an obvious connection between EIS and body-worn cameras.
Sure.
Two similar questions that came in for you were, do you have policies and procedures for body-worn cameras and the early intervention system? I think they mean that, how are they integrated once again? And then did you update your EIS categories when you implemented the body-worn camera program?
Yeah, so we have a separate BWC policy, and that covers the wearing of where the officers have to wear their body-worn camera, depending on what unit they're assigned to and what their uniform of the day is, in terms of tagging our videos, like the director said earlier, categorizing what the videos and what that incident captured. And then as far as the EWS side, we have policy in place also, because our officers, our training officers who review the complaints, the first thing they do before they come to any conclusion or determination on as far as the training that we're going to conduct with the officer is reviewing that footage. So yes, there's a connection with both.
Okay, Director, maybe you want to take this question first. And I do think there's going to be some natural differences here between the two sites here, Sturgis and Camden. But in Sturgis, we'll start off there. What types of variation did you see in terms of officer willingness to use the body-worn cameras or activate their body-worn cameras? And were you able to identify any outliers between those? And how did you respond to those issues?
Early on, I think there was natural apprehension about the body-worn cameras. And I know it's been hit on already. What we found, what the officers found, is that those citizen complaint numbers went down pretty quick, and it was very easy during a lot of those investigations to review the video and say, no, your behavior was absolutely correct. And so it took a couple of those before officers really bought into the body-worn cameras and saw the benefit for them. In terms of willingness, we talk a lot about using the footage for training. How can we get into the eyes of the most people? What can we learn from this footage? As a smaller agency, our supervisors, our sergeants work the road. They work on patrol and respond to calls with their officers on a daily basis. And so there was some apprehension, still is a little bit, by the supervisors on having footage that may not be viewed in a positive light used as training for the department. They feel it may discredit them a little bit. And so really it's being selective in what you're showing, how you're showing it, and really developing a culture within the organization that's about learning from incidents is not necessarily punitive, but just trying to better the organization, better how you can serve your community. When that's developed culturally within the organization, you'll see that willingness goes up pretty quick.
Lieutenant, would you mind commenting on that issue?
So, and there's a couple other questions in the chat for me as well. In terms of in the beginning, when we rolled out our BWCs, it was new, like anything with in the law enforcement community, it takes a little getting used to. So I don't know that we found many officers were apprehensive. It was more just a new tool that at times they were forgetting to activate their cameras. So we had to constantly remind them. And what we did was our watch commander and would put out a message frequently throughout each hour where officers are reminded to activate their body worn cameras. And we went as further as when I was a sergeant to my officers who were constantly forgetting their late activations or early deactivations as if they're assigned to a car, because we have several different units, walking beats, bike patrol. But if they're in a car, we say that the mindset to get in is steering wheel to steering wheel. As soon as you get dispatched to a call, you activate it, and then you don't deactivate until you get back in the car, steering wheel to steering wheel. And that's somewhat helped. So I think we've gone through most of our growing pains in terms of that apprehensive attitude in the field.
Lieutenant, what kind of training do you give your body worn camera unit?
Everybody that's assigned to the body worn camera unit on the civilian side receives fair and impartial policing. So they can understand the implicit and explicit bias that we all have and how that applies to police officers. And then we take it a step further. We have the virtual simulator. So we actually let them run through some scenarios to see what it's like in an officer's shoes, if you will, and handling situations like that, somebody that's combative. So that's some of the training that we provide them, in addition to how to access evidence.com and review videos and what to look for in terms of tagging and categorizing, things of that nature.
And then how much access do your officers have to the data within their EIS system? I don't know if you have some sort of a dashboard that they can review, or which system you're on in terms of EIS, and if the officers have access to it.
The officers themselves do not have access to our early warning system. That goes through the training unit. It sends a trigger, if you will. We call it the officer triggered to those assigned to the training unit. We also get requests for training as well, which is a formal document that's submitted to the training unit. And the officer will review that and be entitled to review that and understand why they either triggered for training. And again, I'll use demeanor as a broad spectrum, or if it's a training request that we receive. We also get the, on the internal affairs side, internal affairs also uses BWC to review any type of complaint that they have. We're constantly communicating between the BWC unit and internal affairs in reviewing the body worn footage.
We only have about 2 or 3 more minutes. Does anybody have, unless another question pops up, does anybody have any closing comments that you might like to share with the group? We did just have one question come in. Do you report triggered officers to the district attorney's office for Brady purposes?
No, we do not. The EWS, and it's just simply that, the early warning system. So the early warning system is designed to prevent that from happening. It's basically, we identify an issue that we see that an officer and how they're conducting themselves, and we get ahead of it right away. And how we do that is, as soon as the system is designed to trigger after maybe, let's just say 4 events in a demeanor complaint. If we have 4 demeanor issues that come up, they'll automatically be sent for training. So we can alleviate being sent to, it wouldn't be the DA's office, it would be the prosecutor's office. And that would be cycled through or funneled through internal affairs. But there's 2 facets of what we do, and it all is circumvented through internal affairs. Some are incidents that are internal affairs complaints where once they complete their investigation on the officer, they determine then it's just training is required, or then progressive discipline. But sometimes it's just training and nothing else. So that's how we kind of circumvent that from happening and avoid reports being made to the prosecutor's office or anything further than that.
Okay, well, I think that is about all of our time. We really appreciate each of the presenters' time on this, and I think we'll go ahead and take a break for our next panel in about 10 minutes.